Lions. Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I'm here for my day number 5 play-ins, overview, and analysis. Day number 5, a tad bit different. Obviously, those of you keeping up with Worlds will know what day number 5 is here, but we have finally hit the play-ins knockout stage, and this is the one that we've been building towards for the entirety of the tournament so far. Everybody trying to get one of those top 4 seeds in their group so that they can, at the very least, play some best of 5s for a chance to make the main group stage. Of course, in Group A and Group B, we already have one team out of each. We have Fnatic coming out of Group A with the 4-1 record. We have DRX coming out of Group B with a 5-0 record. Both teams finishing in first. They don't have to play a single best of 5 at this tournament, at least before group stage. They are automatically slotted through due to their group stage performance, which is, of course, great for them. But everybody else fighting for their tournament lives. We're going to be having the 3-4 matchups covered here today. If you are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. What series between the two were you more looking forward to? Was it the Group A 3-4 or was it the Group B 3-4? Obviously, I think both were actually incredibly interesting in their own way. Maybe the better teams in Group B, but maybe the more interesting series overall in Group A. So let me know what you guys thought down in the comment section below going into these games, because a lot of interesting opinions I think you could have overall. But let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump right into my recaps. If you guys have not been around on the channel for longer than just my Worlds coverage, the way that I go about these videos is I'm going to be talking about each series game by game, going game by game, kind of talking about who I thought played really well, who I thought disappointed, where teams can improve, where teams really need to stick to in order to continue their success. And then eventually we'll be going over all of the games that we had here today. And we're going to be kicking it off with the first series that we had of the day, kicking off a little bit earlier, a couple hours earlier. Certainly nicer for me over here on the East Coast. I imagine it was a lot nicer for people around the world as well, having it just be a tad bit earlier. But our first series of the day was the Group B series, the Group B 3-4. Just a reminder, the stakes of this: 3 plays 4 in each group. The winner then goes on to play another best of 5 against number 2 from the opposite group for a chance of getting out of play-ins. So if you don't win here today, your Worlds tournament is officially over. So it is must win or go home. And so basically from this point onwards, any best of 5 is win or go home. But let's go ahead and talk about the Group B matchup. We had the number 3 seeded Mad Lions taking on the number 4 seeded Saigon Buffalo, and game number 1 was a Mad Lions win, and this was an incredibly clean game from them overall, which is something that, quite frankly, I wasn't expecting. I'm sure a lot of other people out there were not expecting a ridiculously clean game from Mad Lions. They aren't necessarily known for their clean games, even though they played really well in the regular season. In the LEC, obviously some troubles in playoffs, and even in their regular season wins, they weren't the cleanest wins of all time. They were usually just able to dominate a lot of the mid game, be able to transition a lot of their advantages that they were able to create in the jungle and in the mid lane to the rest of the map. This was a little bit of a different formula, although very similar in the sense of you still have Unforgiven and Kaiser in the bot lane on weak side, definitely trying to play weak side into this Caitlyn Morgana. I want to give a quick shout out to Unforgiven in this game because it's not easy to play into Caitlyn, especially when you're not getting any sort of resources. For him to come out of lane, only really down like 15, 20 CS, go into the late game and really be useful as the Jinx, I think facilitated a lot for Mad Lions in the back half of this game. Not having to deal with any Caitlyn shenanigans was really good for them. I think Caitlyn generally is a little overrated, but it is still an incredibly dominant pick in lane. It's something that really is going to take over whatever laning phase it's a part of. And while Unforgiven did lose, he lost gracefully to the point where the rest of the team was able to rebound, and they absolutely did. Really, really solid game here from Mad Lions. You pick up the Gnar for Armet in the top lane, you go for a carry-oriented jungler in the Hecarim, and a more supportive roam-oriented mid laner in the Sylas. All the things that you want to see out of Mad Lions kind of coming out in this game, and they executed on it flawlessly. Elyoya got a really early lead on the Hecarim, was able to take over the game from basically like minute 8 or so, and then from that point onwards, he was just able to transition a lot of that lead into skirmishes and team fights around the map, mostly involving these solo laners, who you have to talk about as kind of being the main players here. Let's talk about Niski first. Led the game in kills, was really, really good on this Sylas. I mean, this is just a prototypical Niski game. He was able to control a lot of the tempo, coming out of the mid lane. Elyoya did help to control that a little bit early, but as soon as Sylas got a little bit of gold on him, he was able to shove, move to a lot of these plays. These objectives were incredibly difficult for Saigon Buffalo to actually try and contest, and a lot of that was due to the fact that Niski was just so much farther ahead in the game than someone like Froggy, especially when you're going into that Vex. In particular, Vex really has one mode, which is go in, and if she's playing from behind against a pretty tanky comp like Mad Lions, it's just going to be very difficult for them to actually deal with that. And then, of course, you get Narmut in the top lane. You gotta feel excited for him. I mean, Armut was a Wukong one-trick, and then he realized that Wukong's a jungle champion in 2022, so he switched it up to Gnar here, and he pulls it out. He gets his best champion, the one that he played pretty much 100% of the time in the LEC regular season, and he honestly looked great on it. There's no complaints coming from me. He is actually going to be my player of the game on Gnar. Some of these engages were absolutely phenomenal. He handled the laning phase really well. I've been more complimentary of Hazmed than I think a lot of other analysts out there, but even I can say that he's certainly not the most consistent top laner in the world, and pulling out the Gwen here, really wanting to try and smash the Gnar relatively early. Gwen, as I've talked about on this channel, is a really good pick into this kind of tank meta that we're getting. It's good into Gnar, it's good into Maokai, it's good into Ornn or Sedge or all these things, right? Because she can burst them down so quickly, especially in the early game if she's laning into them in particular. But Armut plays the laning phase so well as this Gnar that he is able to generate his own lead, and then by the late game, he is an absolute menace. These teamfights are very, very difficult for Saigon to actually win because you have a Hecarim running in, disrupting a lot of your backline, which already your backline damage is low. Really, your only backline damage is Caitlyn, and it's not like Caitlyn's going to be outputting a ton of damage, especially if she doesn't get ridiculously far ahead in the early game. Everything else, like the Gwen, the Vex, the Maokai even, they all want to go for this like synchronized dive attempt on the backline, but you have so many tools to disengage on the side of Mad Lions. That's very much why I assumed they wanted to go with the Tahm Kench in the support position, but even something like the Gnar does a really good job of helping the Jinx out, giving her a shot at actually being able to kite out these fights, and making it a lot easier for Mad Lions, and especially when he's so far ahead. If he can land a really good ultimate in a team fight, get a Q off, like, that's half the health of whoever he hits just gone, including the Maokai. Like, he does that much damage towards the back half of this game, and it makes it very, very difficult for Saigon to win as long as he's playing it well, and luckily for Mad, Armut was playing well. I've been critical of Armut over the course of the year. To me, he was very clearly the weak link of Mad Lions over the course of the regular season, but I actually think he's been pretty good so far at the World Championships in particular. Obviously, I think Mad in general has looked good, but Armut, I think, has definitely stepped up. He's my player of the game. Like I said, really good game from Niski in the mid lane. Unforgiven did a great job on weak side. Elyoya and Kaiser just facilitating everything. It was just a clean Mad Lions win. Like, they had control early. They were able to transition that into objectives in the mid game. They ended up getting Baron, and they were able to close out the game with some good team fights in the back half. It's about as standard and clean of a Mad Lions game as you could ask for, but that's got to frustrate Saigon Buffalo fans because that's really not what you want this series to be if you're a Saigon Buffalo fan. You kind of need this series to be a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more explosive. That's where SGB has been at their best the entirety of this play-in stage. Obviously, the crazy picks come to mind, but even just the skirmishing, they're an incredibly talented team at actually controlling fights even from behind. They're very, very good at that. And in an environment where they're just not able to set up a lot of those fights, it can be very difficult for them to be able to generate consistent leads, which we kind of saw in this game. They index very heavily into laning phase in particular. You draft the Gwen in the top lane to try and punish the Gnar pick. You have the Caitlyn Morgana in the bot lane to try and generate a gigantic lead, but you don't have a ton of team fighting tools outside of those two. If the Gwen's not ahead, she's really not going to be able to have the same kind of impact as something like a Sylas or a Hecarim that she will need to match in terms of damage in this game, and there's just absolutely no way that if Caitlyn doesn't just dominate laning phase that she's going to be doing even remotely the same kind of damage as Jinx in the late game. Even with Jinx down, that's just how those champions' interactions work, and so you're relying a lot on Froggy in order to do a lot of the damage in the back half of this game. Hazmed, if you can get him there, but Froggy never really gets a chance to dive in because, like I said, it's very difficult to actually get on the Jinx in this comp, especially if you just body block the ultimate. Froggy can actually not get in very easily, and if Vex can't get in, Vex really doesn't do a lot. There really isn't a lot of secondary utility coming out from that champion, and then, like I said, for the Gwen, pretty much had to win lane and just couldn't. You have the Maokai here that, quote-unquote, is supposed to be able to control the matchup, but certainly was not. Elyoya outplayed Beanjay a lot in this series, but we'll get to this game number one first. Not a good game from Beanjay. He has not had a good tournament. In my opinion, he's been probably the worst player on this team by a considerable margin over the course of Worlds so far. I was talking about this in my preview. He absolutely has to step up and play well against a really good jungler in Elyoya for Saigon Buffalo to even have a shot at being able to take the series, and unfortunately, it couldn't happen in game number 1. He's going to get my dud of the game in game 1, but obviously Saigon's still relatively in a spot where they could be able to pull out a surprise win or 2, but they're going to need more than that. They're going to need 3 more wins, and now they've lost 1 more game to do it in. Do I think this team has the talent to do it? Maybe. I'm not going to be, like, super confident in that, but do I think they have the explosiveness to catch Matt off guard in a couple of these games? Absolutely. This is a team that is very versatile in the way that they can take and generate fights, and if they can get them on their terms, oftentimes they're going to be able to perform in them. That's just the kind of team that Saigon Buffalo is. I don't like the draft. I want you to go to something that is significantly more skirmish heavy rather than just straight 1v1 or 2v2 lane dominant heavy. I want you to try to make plays, try to find picks, things like that. I think suit the style a lot better. But for Mad Lions, this is about as perfect of a game 1 as you could ask for. They go to their style and it absolutely works out. Obviously, you're not going to get everything that you got in game number 1 here again in game number 2. A lot of things are probably going to be taken away. But the idea of this draft, I think, fits what they want to do pretty much perfectly into a T. So I wouldn't expect too much variation coming out from Matt after game number 1. But that is game number 1. Matt having that lead means Saigon really has to step up. Game number 2 is incredibly influential in a lot of these series. I always talked about that in the playoffs on my channel, and so Saigon basically has to win this game number 2. You definitely don't want to go down 2-0 against a very good team like Mad Lions, and so who is able to take game number 2? Well, the winner of game number 2 here at Worlds was Saigon Buffalo. They are able to take game number 2, even up the series at 1-1, and make this a lot more interesting. I was really hoping that this was the route that we would go down in this series rather than it just being a big stomp on the side of Mad Lions. Nobody really wanted to see a complete runaway here, and luckily for us, Saigon Buffalo delivers here in game number 2. I like this draft a ton better for Saigon. They saved topside counter pick for Red 5 here, and that is absolutely ginormous because they see that Mad Lions is kind of going to this comp that they were going to in game 1. Very similar. You've got Niski on a more proactive mid, Elyoya carry-oriented jungler, but not a lot of damage outside of that. The Gnar, the Seraphine, like not really a ton of like actual damage carry threats. So they say screw it, and they go for the Vayne top here to really try and punish that Gnar pick. And once you take that off the board, it's really difficult for Mad Lions' comp to actually function in the way it needs to. It's really relying on Gnar being that frontline initiator, especially towards the back half of the game, and man, did Saigon Buffalo do a lot to take that out here. The Vayne obviously incredibly toxic to play against in the top lane, at least in the laning phase. A lot of top lane players will tell you that, but you gotta give credit where credit's due, and Hazmed did play it really, really well in this game. It's not like it's a free auto win kind of pick. You do need to be a lot smarter on it, and Hazmed, while he played ridiculously aggressive this game, certainly got himself into positions that he didn't need to be in all the time, really did win a lot of that top lane matchup, and put Saigon in a really good position to just be able to take over a lot of this game, essentially, from the mid-game onwards, and you gotta give him a lot of credit for that. The Dark Tech actually ends up working out. You accent that because you do have a lot of damage now with Vayne and Misfortune, not a lot of AP. You accentuate that with the Maokai, with the Lissandra. It makes it a little bit more difficult to just straight up stack armor against this team, even though theoretically it still would be relatively optimal, but Maokai and Lissandra can still initiate and be a problem, and so you can't completely ignore them, especially if the Maokai gets ahead. Lissandra you really can never ignore under any circumstance. And then you have the MF in the bot lane, always going to be super useful. You have a ton of CC on this team. You compound potential Lissandra ultimate with Maokai ultimate, or even just a Maokai engage. You compound that with Nautilus going in. Like, you just have a ton of actual engage pressure to set up for Misfortune ultimates. Towards the back half of this game, we've seen Shogun pull out the MF multiple times throughout this tournament. I've actually praised him on multiple occasions, not only for finding really good times to press that R button, but also for being really consistent with the damage that he's putting out without the R button. The Misfortune can sometimes be a pick that relies a ton on the ultimate to actually be effective towards the back half of games, but good players will know that they can step up and can do some damage if they have their team around them to protect them, and I think Saigon knows how to play around Shogun, especially in these late game team fights, really well, but none of them are my player of the game. My player of the game here is going to go to Taki here on the support Nautilus, and great game from him. In my opinion, easily the best game that he has had at Worlds so far. I honestly think he's been pretty up and down at the World Championships. In their wins, he often looks good. He's enabling Shogun and really allowing him to be one of the more outstanding AD carries at the tournament. Sometimes in their losses, though, he can look pretty bad. A lot of really, really questionable engages on picks like Leona and Nautilus, but especially on picks like Leona. There were multiple times where it's just like, man, please just hit an ultimate. Like, I need you to actually hit somebody at some point in the game. But he picks up the Nautilus here in a pretty tough matchup. Maybe not in lane, but just in general against Unforgiven and Kaiser. And he honestly plays it really well. This is his best game of the tournament, like I said, so far. And for that, he's going to get player of the game for Saigon Buffalo. Without these Nautilus engages, the Vayne has a significantly more difficult time actively taking advantage of a lot of the things in her kit that make her good. Obviously, she was able to generate a pretty big lead in that top lane by herself, but if you want her to be useful in that late game, same with the Maokai or the Misfortune or any of that, the CC is ridiculously important. And I thought Taki really, really locked that up and did a lot of really good things for the Saigon Buffalo team. I don't know if they win nearly as easily if he's not at support, but obviously Hazmed is going to be the kind of standout player of this game purely for that Dark Tech Vayne top that everybody is going to be fawning over. But for Mad Lions, it's a little bit of a frustrating loss. You really would have liked to go up 2-0 in the series, but obviously when you're up 1-0, you can at least kind of afford to lose game 2. It's essentially just resetting the series here, making it a best of 3, and you definitely have some things you need to work around. This is, again, a very similar comp, in my opinion, to Game 1. The one major difference, in my opinion, being no hyper carry in the bot lane. You switch out that Jinx for the Seraphine. That's going to give you a ton more sustain and a ton more supportive if you really want Elyoya to be able to take over this game, but it also lessens your damage by a considerable margin, which sometimes can be problematic, and it really was taken advantage of by that R5 Vayne pick, which was genius on the side of Saigon Buffalo. I see a lot of people heavily criticizing Mad Lions for that pick, and I just don't. I like this draft, generally speaking, and I talked about this in one of my previous videos at Worlds here so far, where I was like, if you see a low damage comp and you want to go this full sustain route with the Seraphine, the Hecarim, we saw it with the Swain before, pull the trigger on that because it can be really difficult to actively deal with if the enemy doesn't go for like a ton of damage. But unfortunately for them, they bring out that Vayne and it really does counter a lot of it. You really aren't expecting them to be able to pull that out in this case, so it's really hard for me to blame them, but definitely unfortunate on the side of Mad Lions. Outside of that, Arma getting beaten up in the top lane certainly didn't help their chances in this game at all. Not a very good game from Arma. He bounces back here. He gets the Gnar again, but into Vayne, that is a very, very difficult matchup. Vayne and Gnar relatively have similar ranges when Gnar is mini, but Vayne just does significantly more damage, especially early in the game. The attack speed can be a huge problem, and you're oftentimes just going to get bullied out of that. That really got Hazmed super far ahead in this game, and he was able to affect a lot of the map here, being a really big nuisance for pretty much anybody on the enemy team to be able to take down, because at the end of the day, yes, there's a ton of like drain tank scaling, like supportive options for Mad Lions. You've got the Seraphine, you've got the Hecarim with his lifesteal, even Gnar is very difficult to take down, but none of them are like inherently all that tanky if you can get them in a 1v1 with Vayne. And especially because she shreds so quickly, it can be very difficult for this comp to actively deal with her, and she was able to cause a huge amount of problems. Compound that with the fact that Shogun was able to get quite a bit of gold on this Misfortune towards the middle part of this game, and you really don't have a lot of tools to be able to team fight like this team really needs to do. Obviously, it's hard for me to sit here and say that the draft and the idea are entirely wrong in this case, but it's certainly something to consider that Saigon have now shown that they can pull out these high damage comps. And obviously, we know that they're going to be willing to pull the trigger on these more aggressive ideas. Things that might not transition as well if they aren't able to win early, they are going to invest in and, you know, do the things necessary in order for them to look really good going into that mid game. And that's just something that you need to be aware of as Mad Lions. I know you want to play these more quote-unquote passive, more scaling, like Seraphine-oriented comps, as I like to call them, where you just want to make sure that everybody stays alive and that you can heal through essentially all the damage the enemy team wants to do, but I'm just not sure Saigon Buffalo is the opponent to do that on, because they're not someone who I think is going to easily allow you to do that the entire time. Unfortunately, Arma gets dud of the game, but really, I think you could give dud of the game to quite a few people. Elyoya wasn't really ever in a spot to do anything in this game. Got out jungled by Beanjay early. Not that it was entirely like a jungle diff, but lanes were always in favor of Saigon Buffalo, and that's always going to favor jungle on the winning side. And then Unforgiven and Kaiser were not nearly as good on weak side. This game, a lot of investment over to the side of Saigon Buffalo, wanting to make sure that that Misfortune was in a good spot. Obviously, Taki played really well. Unforgiven Seraphine was not nearly as effective as his Jinx at scaling into that late game in the way that they needed. So Definitely some things that Mad Lions needs to improve. Overall, it's just an adaptation kind of thing. I'm not saying that the Mad Lions comp is bad, but clearly Saigon Buffalo have shown that they know exactly what they need to do into that comp. So it might be time to pivot to something else. Obviously, Niski pulled out some high damage carries throughout the group stage. It's not necessarily what he's known for, but it's something that could be possible. Playing through Elyoya in Unforgiven definitely was something that did not work for this team in the playoffs, so it's going to be interesting to see what exactly they end up transitioning to throughout the rest of the series. But Game 3 and the way they approach Game 3 is going to be incredibly crucial for them overall. For the Buffalo, though, really, really good to get this win. It puts you back on track. You're now just in a best of 3 against Mad Lions, which theoretically you should be able to at least compete in. You only have to win 2 more games from this point onwards, and we know you have a lot of crazy picks to pull out. Obviously, the Vayne top, the Zach mid, we've seen a ton of crazy stuff from this team. If they can just continue onwards, if Shogun and Taki can really step up and outperform Unforgiven and Kaiser, which I do think is possible. If Hazmed can really be a dominant force up in that top lane, they maybe can hide some of the weaknesses that their mid jungle has been showing over the course of the tournament like they did in this game. But are they going to continuously be able to do that? That is going to be found out as we move in to game number 3 here. Which team is going to go up 2-1 and really stake their claim to being in a good position in this matchup? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Mad Lions. They are able to take game number 3, reestablish themselves in a very good spot in this series overall, and get back to an identity that they really started to establish at this tournament rather than what they were known for more domestically over the course of the year, and that is feeding the beast that is Elyoya in the jungle. Now, you can kind of talk about who the best player on this Mad Lions team is as a general whole, but especially over the course of this tournament and probably over the course of the last few years, Elyoya has been the one that has unlocked everything for Mad Lions. I'm not saying it was entirely him, but he certainly has helped this team a ton over the past few years get over that hump and get into the point where they can genuinely be a contender on the world stage. A lot of that has been Elyoya coming into this team and unlocking a lot of it for them, even with people coming in and out, you know, with Niski and Elyoya trying to fill some pretty big shoes, obviously with the departure of the reigning European champions, but still, I think Elyoya being through all of it has really kept Mad Lions consistent, and it's a big reason why I think they were able to perform a lot in the regular season, so I understand just wanting to invest and trust into him. He looked phenomenal on the Bel'Veth yesterday in their matchup against DRX. They weren't able to pull out the win because they weren't able to secure it late game, but Elyoya still looked phenomenal in that game, was absolutely able to counter jungle and out jungle just Pioshik in general. And if he can do it against Pioshik, he can probably do it against BJ. That's kind of what Mad Lions is relying on with this comp. It's a very similar to what they went to yesterday. You've got the Bel'Veth in the jungle with the Vex in the mid lane. This time you're accentuating it with a lot of CC around it. You've got the Varus in the AD carry role. Obviously not something that's really there for the damage. More so there for the ultimate and its ability to be significantly longer range. The lack of mobility could be theoretically a problem though against a pick like the Hecarim. And then you've got the Tahm Kench and the Gnar. Obviously the Gnar because it's Armut and you want to pick him Gnar. And then the Tahm Kench because first of all, it can keep the Varus safe in laning phase, and then it opens up a lot more opportunities to enable Elyoya in the late game. You can really pump a lot of stuff into him, and then you can have Tahm Kench there for the safety if you need it, but he's also engaged if you needed some CC. Overall, just a good pick with this comp, I would say, overall. And boy, were they able to execute on this strategy in this game. Obviously, you're relying a ton with this comp on the Bel'Veth getting ahead. Without Bel'Veth, you don't really have a carry. Like, Vex is a good champion and can do damage, but Varus certainly can't carry games, and Vex isn't a primary carry type of damage dealer. She really goes in, gets her combo off, hopefully picks up 1 or 2, and then you need somebody else that's going to be able to finish that fight. So you're relying a ton on Elyoya being able to generate that lead. Luckily, they had a very good plan to do so. They really target this aggressive bot lane that Saigon ends up picking. The Kai'Sa obviously not super aggressive, but definitely punishable. The aggressive part is certainly the Shen coming out of Taki, something that really isn't going to be all that safe in the early laning phase. It really has to go in if it is going to, and you can really punish that. And boy, did Elyoya do that. I think by 8 minutes, Elyoya had 3 kills, and the entire game was flipped on its head. BJ was picking up some deaths. Hazmed was picking up some deaths. Shogun and Taki were picking up some deaths. You just hit the point where around 15 minutes where this Bel'Veth was so completely out of control that the game was completely over. It ended up being closed out in like 23 minutes, a complete stop. Only 2 dragons were taken the entirety of this game. The objectives were certainly not the priority. This was feed your jungler, push forward in lanes, try to get towers as quickly as possible, and let's fight as often and as frequently as we can. And that is another style that I do think suits Mad Lions relatively well. Clearly, they have the talent to be able to pull it off at this level. The one thing I would worry about with that strategy in this series is you're kind of playing into Saigon's hands in that respect, because that really is what Saigon wants to do. They want to fight repeatedly. Luckily for them, Saigon goes for a much later game comp. They really don't have a lot of proactive tools here to play the early game out. You're really hoping that this Lilia can be able to deal with the Gnar in the early game, because if she can't, you really don't actually have a lane matchup that's all that good for you. You've got the Lissandra into Vex, which isn't like a bad matchup, but Vex is significantly more impactful, I would say, at least in the early game. Lissandra really needs to hit that ultimate for her to really be as effective as she needs to be. The stun is obviously great, but her damage is just not nearly on the same level as someone like Vex. The Qs are not comparable in my opinion. And then you've got Kai'Sa and Shen in the bottom lane. They clearly just want to scale into the late game. For Shen to get out on the map, he does need to hit 6 as quickly as possible. If you can make early game moves here and get that Bel'Veth rolling, it might be too late by the time all of these champions hit 6, which is crazy to say, but that's honestly what kind of happened to Saigon Buffalo. This is a team that really does want to take a lot of these early game skirmishes, and they just take a draft that doesn't enable that. I understand the Hecarim pick, and I totally get potentially wanting to go to the Lilia as a nice counter pick to the Gnar in the top lane if you think you can dominate that lane and you want to invest in that, and you want to make sure that Lilia can get ahead, because she really can be a nuisance against quote-unquote short-range comps, especially towards the back half. But there are tools to be able to get on her, just not a lot of tools to be able to stick on her. Things like the Varus are important in this comp for being able to stop the Lilia if she's able to get ahead. Luckily for Mad Lions, they never really had to deal with that, because the Lilia was never really in a position to be able to dominate. But it was all just theoretical, right? You're really, again, for Saigon, relying a ton on the Hecarim to be able to make a lot of these plays early game, but especially going into a fed Bel'Veth, like, there's absolutely nothing he could do, and BJ just generally got out-jungled by Elyoya. He does such a phenomenal job at pathing on this champion. Clearly, he's put in a ridiculous amount of hours on the Bel'Veth, and it really, really shows in a lot of these games. He is a very, very easy choice for player of the game. He dominated this one just like he dominated the early game of the DRX game. Luckily, in this one, he wasn't going against Zika, so he didn't have to worry about that late game completely falling into shambles. He was able to close it out. Niski had another good game on the Vex, being really proactive. I really do like him on this champion. I think it fits his playstyle relatively well. He can be active while also not having to be a primary damage threat and source like he would on like an Akali or something like that. That would give you similar mobility, but again, Unforgiven playing weak side, that's kind of just what Mad Lions likes to do, is put Unforgiven and Kaiser on this weak side. The Varus pick I think is interesting. Certainly not something I would have went to in this case by myself, but you know, I get it. It's a lot of CC and it gives you a lot more options. It's just really not giving you almost any damage, at least in comparison to a lot of the other top 80 carries out there right now, but it clearly wasn't what they thought they needed. They knew they had damage with the Bel'Veth, with the Vex. They wanted something that was going to be a little bit more consistent at being able to set up those champions, and so they felt Varus Tahm Kench was going to be that bot lane, and honestly, Unforgiven played it well. Like, I can't complain too much. Clearly, again, they put time in on a comp similar to this, so pretty good game for Mad Lions, hard to complain. And then for Saigon, I already talked about it a bit, but they really just needed this early game to not be this. Like, they scale incredibly well, and I think if they get to that 10-minute mark and can start taking a lot of these skirmishes, when Lissandra and Shen start hitting their 6, when Hecarim can go in fully, when you have Kai'Sa kind of getting online, like that comp is going to be very difficult to beat. But the early game problems that this comp runs into were heavily exploited by Mad Lions, and from that point onwards, it was just always going to be incredibly difficult for Saigon Buffalo to get back into this game. I've said it once, I'll say it 1,000 times, BJ just simply has to be better in this series. If he is going to get completely run over by Elyoya like he did in game number 3 here, Saigon simply does not stand a chance. A big reason they were able to win game 2 was because they were able to generate that early game lead, and they were able to neutralize a lot of the lane threats that Matt had been pumping into. Obviously, a very good draft from Saigon in game 2. It allowed the Vayne to open up, it allowed the Nautilus to be everywhere on the map. But you're not going to get that kind of draft gap in every single game, and so you're going to need, especially the Hecarim in this comp, to be able to step up and be a major damage force for the team, be able to generate a lot of pressure early. And when he loses as hard as he lost in this game in that jungle matchup, it's just going to be nearly impossible for Saigon to come back. No matter how well Hazmed plays that top lane matchup, or no matter how well Froggy plays in the mid lane, or no matter how well Shogun, their superstar AD carry, plays in the back half on this Kai'Sa, they're just never going to be able to get to that point if B&J doesn't start stepping up. He's my dud of the game again here in game number 3, and he really is the X factor for Saigon. If he can step up and be a good jungler and compete on the same level as Elyoya, I think Saigon does have a chance in this series, but if he can't do that, Mad Lions should be walking away from it. So that really sets up your storyline here as we move into game number 4. Mad have found a strategy that really works, pumping into that jungle position, letting Niski be that secondary damage source and damage threat that really wants to play along with his jungler that really fits his playstyle. Now it's up to Saigon to match and be able to deal with it like they did with the comps that Mad Lions was bringing out earlier in the series. So are they able to do it? Are they going to fight fire with fire? Or are they going to potentially start sticking to these more scaling comps and have a little bit better of an early game? Well, we'll see now in game number 4 as the winner of game number 4 was Mad Lions. They are able to do it. They're able to pick up a huge win in game number 4 and secure their spot in a best of 5 tomorrow against Evil Geniuses to try and get themselves to the main group stage of Worlds this year. An amazing result for Mad Lions. Not only is it obviously win or go home for this team, but this is the first best of 5 that this Mad Lions team has won as a group of 5. In spring, in summer, they weren't able to pick up a single best of 5 series in either of the playoffs. Of course, with the different European qualifying this year, obviously, an extra team going from Europe, essentially getting the CIS spot, that being Mad Lions. They did end up making the World Championships anyways, but it's got to be such a relief to the players and to the organization that they can at least win a best of 5 on a big stage if they need to. Obviously, this was essential to continue on in your tournament life, but even mentally, even if you theoretically could lose this, mentally, I don't think it was possible for you to lose a series like this on a stage as big as this and continue to believe in yourself in the same way going into a major matchup with Evil Geniuses. So for them to do it so convincingly in this game number 4 has to feel incredibly good. Both drafts are actually kind of interesting here. I really don't like Mad just straight running it back. A lot of the tools that they have here are countered pretty well by Saigon, who just goes an incredibly aggressive comp. They just want to fight. You draft the Pantheon, you draft the Kalista. You want that early aggression. You are begging Elyoya to try and generate that same kind of lead in the bot lane that he did in the previous games because it's going to be nowhere near as easy. And even then, you go for side laners that can be a little bit more proactive in the game. Fiora, because she is going to split that map, she's going to cause panic towards the back half of the game. Gonna make sure that those 5v5 team fights aren't nearly as easy because she's gonna be split pushing, taking inhibitor towers, and you have to make sure that you mark her the entire game. And for Taliyah, because if you do want to go for this early aggression, Taliyah actually does a really good job of being able to shove in someone like a Vex, and her and Pantheon together are an incredibly dangerous duo. Considering both of them have semi-global ultimates, they can show up in a fight basically instantaneously. It can cause a ton of problems for Mad Lions. Overall, Mad Lions goes to the same comp. They really need Bel'Veth to get ahead. Again, she is still the only carry threat on this team. You've now replaced the Gnar with an Ornn in the top lane, and you've got the Alistar in the support role. Other than that, you're completely unchanged from last game. I understand the idea of just running it back, but I'm not super in love with this comp because, again, you're risking so much on Elyoya getting ahead. If he doesn't, you just straight lose the game. Lucky for them, he's simply just the best player on the Rift. And so he is able to generate his lead in a very similar way. He's able to get 3 kills incredibly early in this game again. And it's just insane. It's insane how ridiculously consistent Elyoya is on this champion, on other carry champions. He is the heart and soul of Mad Lions. I know Niski is the LEC MVP, and trust me, we'll get to him. He certainly played like it at certain points in this game, but Elyoya is the heart and soul of Mad Lions, and he proved it by basically carrying this team to a series win here against Saigon Buffalo on the world stage. He's gonna get my player of the game again here in game number 4. Spoiler alert for a little bit later, he is going to be my player of the series. He was phenomenal in this series for Mad Lions overall. That's not even really up for debate. I mean, put him on something that can genuinely just win the game. If you get him snowballing, the game is over. Mad Lions had control of this game the entire time. We'll get into it because Saigon did a good job staying in the game, but Mad certainly did everything they needed to do in this early game to put them in the position to move on to Evil Geniuses tomorrow. While Elyoya was great, though, he could not have done this without Niski in the mid lane playing his Vex so impeccably. I had no idea his Vex was this good, but all 3 times that he's pulled it out now at the World Championships, this team has looked genuinely great. This Bel'Veth Vex combo is incredibly dangerous, and I would expect it to now be on the map for every single team that goes up against Mad Lions. from here on out. I don't expect both of these to make it through practically any ban phase, as the duo together are incredibly dangerous on Elyoya and Niski. Niski's engage potential on this champion to be able to facilitate Elyoya being able to free hit with all of that damage that he's able to generate just leads to so much chaos. Obviously, adding into that the ridiculous amount of CC that this comp can generate. If you are theoretically doing a 5v5, if you have the Ornn ultimate with the Varus ultimate, you have Alistar's entire kit, like the amount of lockdown that this team has, the amount of time that it gives Elyoya to free hit, especially if he's ahead, is actually ludicrous and incredibly fun to watch. A super fun comp to just funnel the jungler and have it work, but truly, while Elyoya was great and was the player of the game because he did carry, they could not have done this without Niski, without Kaiser. All of them played super duper well in this game, and you gotta give credit to Mad Lions where it's due. They played around their carry perfectly, essentially, and they got the win, and they're moving on to the next round. Unfortunately for Saigon, it just wasn't enough. Again, they lost the early game, got behind pretty early, which is detrimental to this comp because you're drafting the Pantheon in the jungle. You're drafting the Kalista in the bottom lane, two things that really want to try and be able to control the tempo. Kalista, especially into Varus, should have no problems being able to control that lane, but Shogun didn't have the same kind of game that he needed to here. Taki did try to play aggressive, but a lot of times they were just getting disengaged a lot easier. BJ wasn't playing around that bot lane nearly as much as I was expecting. He was actually playing a lot around Froggy on the Talia in the mid lane. Not exactly what I would have wanted him to do, but his Pantheon was keeping this game alive. There were a lot of mid-game skirmishes, and that is exactly where Saigon Buffalo thrives, in my opinion, the most. They were able to get a lot of these and keep themselves in the game. Like I said, Matt did have control of this game throughout the entirety of it, but pretending like Saigon certainly didn't have moments where they looked like they were not dead in the water. Like, they had some awesome moments. They had some really good fights around the mid lane. I remember one right near Baron or Herald Pit. I don't remember what time of the game it was, but a really phenomenal fight that BJ absolutely smurfed in and was able to pop off and turn that around for the Buffalo. And then they were also doing a really good job of being able to control dragons as well. They were actually able to stack dragons relatively efficiently. Unfortunately, they just weren't able to turn a lot of that into active combat pressure. They really wanted to get that Fiora rolling in the side wave, but unfortunately, there really was just never an opportunity because Mad was so threatening to just roll it down mid with that 5v4 and just end the game because they just pushed straight up faster than that Fiora could match. So Fiora was often in a lot of these 5v5 team fights where she's really not all that good. And unfortunately for her, Hazmid, I don't know if he's just not super familiar with Fiora, but he played it super fast, way too fast on Fiora in almost all of these team fights, going in, using riposte essentially immediately, and then trying to get all the damage off, and just getting CC'd and killed. Like, I understand there's a ton of CC on the enemy side, and you can't riposte everything, but I think with Fiora in this case, you have to be significantly more patient with how you approach a lot of these fights, or else you're just going to get killed early on and you're not going to contribute nearly enough. You can team fight pretty well as Fiora, but again, you have to know your limits, and I don't think Hazmed knew that. Unfortunately, that means he's going to get my dud of the game here, but nobody was really excellent. I thought BJ had some really good plays in team fights. He got Froggy some gold here, and those two were able to do some things, but at the end of the day, they were never going to be able to match Elyoya and Niski in the same role on the enemy team, and that led to their downfall in a lot of these team fights. So definitely frustrating if you're Buffalo. This means the end of your Worlds experience, but it's hard to feel like this was a disappointment. You get drawn into a play-ins group with 3 major region teams, 2 of them being DRX and Royal Never Give Up. Like, you were always going to be at a disadvantage to begin with, and you were able to pull off pretty consistent wins against every other minor region team. Unfortunately, you weren't able to beat Mad Lions in that best of 5, but you showed a lot of heart, a lot of passion. Shogun was phenomenal at this tournament, and I thought Hazmed certainly had his ups and downs. BJ, Froggy, Taki certainly were inconsistent to say the very least, and I think that's what, at the end, held Buffalo from being one of the teams that could compete on the level of Mad Lions, but there are a lot of fun players on this team, and the VCS really did show that with their crazy picks and their skirmish-heavy playstyle that they really can compete at this level against some of the best teams in the world, and it was really fun to watch. I gave my player of the series earlier. That is going to be Elyoya for Mad Lions. Unfortunately, my dud of the series is going to go to the same role, but for Saigon, it's going to go to BJ. He was unfortunately kind of the letdown of Saigon Buffalo at Worlds. I definitely think he can have a bounce back here, but his aggressive playstyle just didn't quite get Saigon in the position that it needed to be in. A lot of the success that they were able to find was when BJ was on more tank-oriented picks, things that were a little bit more survivable. When he had to play the Hecarim, these more aggressive picks that needed to go in, they definitely saw a little bit more frustrating plays from them. But you could say that for pretty much everybody in these minor region teams. Honestly, just at the end of the day, they've got to be proud of what they were able to accomplish, even though they weren't able to make it to that final best of 5. They did the best that they could. They even took a game off of Mad in this series, which has to feel pretty good for them, but that's going to be it for their series, and Mad Lions is now officially moving on to play Evil Geniuses tomorrow. I'm going to preview both series at the end of the day, but quick thoughts on that. Very, very good form that Mad is going into here. Honestly, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's anybody's guess as to how that series is going to turn out. Mad played really, really, really well today, and if Elyoya and Niski can control the game exactly like they did in this series, Mad is going to be able to beat pretty much any challenge that EG throws their way, but it's all about the consistency. If this Mad shows up, great. If playoffs Mad shows up, I'm a little bit more concerned with the outlook, but for now, like, they're looking great. They just have to maintain their form here. All right, now that we've gone through the first series, the Group B series here in the 3-4 matchups, it's time to move on to Group A. And I was talking about this earlier in the video, but while Group B may have had the two teams that were probably a little bit better, I think we all could have guessed how that series would have turned out. This one is definitely much more up in the air, in my opinion. Both teams really showing a lot on the world stage at this point, one with some history, and one that's kind of emerging right now. And so it's really exciting to see the matchup here between the 3rd-seeded Loud and the 4th-seeded Detonation FocusMe. Brazil and Japan have never played each other in a best-of-5 on the international stage, and it starts here at the World Championships in 2022, and the first one to strike in game number 1 is Loud. So Brazil gets the upper hand in game number 1, and it's off of the back of a ridiculous game. It's really difficult to even talk about this game in, like, a way that is analytical, because it kind of bucks a lot of the trends and a lot of the things that we know about League of Legends, just in general. When you draft Olaf, Misfortune, and then Maokai and Akali, you can expect 2 of those to be really good early game, and the other 2 to be really good in the late game, but it was kind of flipped here, and it was the exact same on the side of DFM. You have 2 primary damage dealers. On the side of DFM, you've got the Azir, and you've got the Caitlyn. Caitlyn notably dominating lane, like that's what Caitlyn does. She's a lane-dominant champion, and then Azir, a late game hyper carry. Those auto attacks in the late game can output legit primary carry levels of damage, but what lane was the one of those that won? The Azir. What lane actually did really, really well in the late game? The Caitlyn. Like, what exactly happened this game? It was very weird to watch. Not only that, but just the way everything ended up happening. It was incredibly close. Loud lost, being down 2 kills. They were up in gold because they had every Baron. Shout out Croc, but just insane one. So, first of all, gotta give both credit and, I don't know, the opposite of credit, hatred? I don't know. You gotta give them both to Robo in this game. He played the Olaf here, a signature pick of his for a long time in the CB LOL. Longtime fans of his will at least know that. I had to look that up, but longtime CB LOL fans will know that. And he pulls it out here, and I think it's fine. Relatively speaking, you can dominate the lane. Into Gnar, you should be able to generate a significant lead that helps get the Maokai on the board, which can then, of course, lead to, ideally, Akali getting on the board, and then you can do a lot from there, but that's not exactly what happened here. The Olaf actually lost lane pretty hard in this matchup, which is pretty much unacceptable, like, for an Olaf player. If you lose lane, you're pretty much going to get outscaled by everyone, most especially a Gnar. Like, he goes into the late game, I think he was like 3-5 at around like 20-25 minutes. And then the scaling Olaf hit, which is, I can't even begin to tell you how unbelievable this is. He essentially played like a Aatrox in the late game, which is, it's just really crazy to say. He was able to go in, he had a ton of CC around him with the Amumu, with the Maokai, to be able to just kind of jump on the backline and try to drain tank his way into winning fights for Loud. And it actually worked. Like, I don't know what to say, but it actually worked. It wasn't the Akali. It wasn't the Misfortune. Hell, it wasn't even the Maokai with the stuns. It was the Olaf that won this game for Loud, even after a pretty horrible start. So yeah, Robo's my player of the game. And yeah, I've been really high on Robo over the course of the group stage, but even I don't know how to feel about this performance. Losing on Olaf in the early game is unacceptable. You can't take that and then lose in the laning phase. But man, did he really turn it around towards the back half of this game. Without him, they don't win. So it's just difficult to get an idea of what exactly happened here. But you got to give Robo credit. He at least stepped up and did the role that he needed to in the late game to help Loud get that really important victory. Also want to give a lot of credit to Seos. He's actually been incredibly underrated, in my opinion, throughout the entirety of Worlds so far. He has been one of the best supports at the tournament, and the Amumu is a big part of that. Obviously, MF Amumu is a gigantic lane here for Loud. I tweeted out during this game that you cannot allow this bot lane to have MF Amumu anymore because you're going into Caitlyn Morgana, and typically, Caitlyn is going to be able to dominate that lane. She's going to be able to generate a significant gold lead and CS lead. She does fall off a lot harder than Miss Fortune does, but it's not like Miss Fortune is some hyper carry damage in the late game, and so really the best that you're hoping for is just that the ultimates can land with the Amumu stuns in the late game and that you can become really strong from that, but what do you know it? The Miss Fortune beat the Caitlyn in lane, and that is, it's just, I don't know how this happens. I don't know what happened this game. It's really, really difficult for me to give you any sort of analysis because it really is an anti-analytical game just in general. If all that wasn't enough, right? Like, DFM was actually in a pretty decent spot towards the middle of this game. They were around even in gold. I think they were down maybe like 1 or 2K, but it was a relatively even gold split, and DFM was making a really good push on the Baron. What do you know? No one marks Croc. He gets in and steals the Baron away from Steel. Haha, funny. It happens. Sometimes 50-50 coin flips happen. Nobody was marking the Maokai. You know, it is what it is. And then we get Mountain Dragon, and I can't even begin to tell you how unbelievable it is that it happened twice in a row. DFM's in a great spot. No one marks the Maokai. The Misfortune ult, by the way, I wanna credit Brant here. The Misfortune ult was absolutely perfectly timed. It basically zoned everybody else out, made it a true 50-50 because no one could actively mark the Maokai. He goes in, gets the steal again here for Loud. And those two plays were absolutely ginormous for them winning the game. Now, a lot of people are going to point to that saying Loud would have lost if not that, if not for that, but people forget that they were in a pretty commanding lead before kind of throwing it in the mid game. And so for DFM, looking back on this, it's not as simple as, oh, if we just land those 2 smites, we win. You have to have a significantly better early game, and a lot of that is going to have to be your bot lane. Yutapon and Harp did not play well at all in game number 1. Obviously, they've been a huge part of DFM's run throughout the tournament so far, but you give them the Caitlyn Morgana, they really need to be able to demolish lane, and that's just not the playstyle that I think these two are more comfortable with. Obviously, the pick for Yutapon at this tournament so far has been the Kai'Sa, and that's made a lot of sense for them because he does like to play a more aggressive in that mid to late game and be more of a hyper carry. He doesn't want to dominate that laning phase. It's really just not the way they want to play. They want to invest a lot into Yaharong because he's really good at getting ahead and then being able to scale the game from there. Picks like the Azir, picks like the Vex have been pretty big for him throughout Worlds so far. That's the lane that they most notably wanted to invest in, but obviously Evi's no slouch either with resources, and so usually Yutapon and Harp are the lane that they kind of ignore, I would say, most often, but with Caitlyn Morgana, you're just kind of taking yourself out of the comfort zone, and clearly the team was not ready for it. Yutapon lost on Caitlyn, which is bad, even though he did really well in the mid-game to kind of get that lead back for DFM, and then Harp on the Morgana was miserable this game. I mean, you really only have to have one ability in order for that champion to be incredibly useful, and that's the Black Shield, but when you're waiting to use Black Shield until all the damage has already been outputted, what's even the point of having the ability in the first place? And Harp just didn't have a good game. Clearly, he's not super experienced on the champion. I very, very much do not want to see them going back to that because it was just bad. Like it was not a good game from Harp. It was not a good game from Yutapon. Certainly, Evi and Yaharong did their best to try and bring the game back, I would say, for DFM. But at the end of the day, it really wasn't working out. And you just got to chalk it up to, unfortunately, we were kind of destined to lose this one. Not only did we not have a good early game with a team that, quite frankly, should be winning early, but we had kind of the game in our hands and weren't able to get the smites. And so you just kind of have to go next. You got to get the mojo out of your brain and you got to move on. And that's easier said than done, but that's the best thing, honestly, that DFM can do. Maybe go for a late game scaling bot lane with an early game top side that you can play towards. Might be a little bit better. For Loud, honestly, it's a win, but it's not the most convincing win. You've definitely still got more to prove. Tinone certainly didn't look good in the mid lane matchup. Got to see more out of them. Branson Seos did look good, and Robo obviously looked good towards the back half of the game, but you just need to see more consistency out of the team as a whole. Croc did not have a good mid game. Yes, the steals were super important, but we got to see him step up and be able to play out a lot of these mid game skirmishes and scenarios a lot better if Loud is going to have a chance to win this. But both teams really with a rocky start overall. I think Game 2 is going to be more important than it is in your traditional series. Obviously, it's incredibly important for DFM because they don't want to go down 2-0. But for Loud, you need to establish some level of confidence. Yes, you won this game, but it wasn't nearly as clean as it needed to be. And so Game 2, very important, I think, for the mental of both of these teams. But who was able to take it here in game number 2? Well, the winner of game number 2 was DFM, as they are able to take game number 2 here, tie up the series at 1-1, and honestly do it in a much better fashion than Loud was able to do it in game number 1. It's got to feel good. Obviously, some good, some bad. I gotta talk about it. If I don't talk about it at the start, I'm just not going to be able to talk about anything else. This is just an atrociously bad draft for Loud. I understand the idea. It goes back to this Mad Lions concept that we talked about earlier in the video, where if the enemy team has low damage threats on their team, you can get away with these really, really kind of drain tanky, very deceptively tanky kind of carries. Things like the Seraphine, things like the Hecarim, the Aatrox, even the Swain can throw in there, but Galio kind of serves that purpose as well. Things that can survive in fights long enough for you to be able to negate a lot of lower damage, and then just be able to heal it all back up because the Seraphine does a lot. Hecarim, Aatrox obviously have their own ways of healing themselves. Alistar can do it as well. A lot of options for that. The problem with that idea is that the enemy team took Azir on B1, on blue, first pick blue side. And then you decide to go this comp, and then they just double down with Tristana, and now it's like, oh, I'm never winning this game. Like, this is legit unwinnable. Like, I'm never a draft guy. Like, anybody who's followed this channel for any amount of time knows that I tend to blame draft about as little as anybody in the community. I think draft is quite frankly a scapegoat often used in times of a team just simply playing better on the day. Most drafts have some sort of win condition, right? They have some way that they can win the game. And if you can play to that win condition better than your opponent can play into their win condition, you can win the game. Yes, some win conditions are simply just harder and don't work nearly as well into other comps, but most comps have a button that they can press to win the game, right? Like, they have a way to move forward. I don't know what that is for Loud, because their carry this game has to be either Aatrox or Hecarim. But how in the world do Aatrox and Hecarim kill Azir and Tristana? Like, in what universe is that even possible? Like, you have set yourself up for a major level of disaster on the side of Loud. I really hate the double low damage combo of mid and bot lane, like this Swain Seraphine idea. I get the idea of it, but I just don't think it works all that well. And especially Galio. I think Galio is honestly just worse at it than someone like Swain. At least Swain does have some level of damage. Galio's not really offering that. You're relying so much on your top side of the map getting ahead, and it just wasn't able to do it in this game. Robo certainly had some moments, but he also had his int moments. We'll get to that, but let's talk about what DFM did right. First of all, their carries were set up to be in a position where they could just dominate this game. I was talking about how Udapon and Harp really shouldn't be playing for laning phase. That's not something that DFM has done super successfully over the course of the year. They're two players that can dominate in the latter half of the game, and that's kind of what you're building for here. Obviously, the Tristana, very good in lane, but is going to be useful out of lane as a target that's really difficult to get on top of and can output a very consistent amount of damage while also not remaining in threat level. And also, she beats Seraphine in lane. Like, it's like a double whammy here that definitely works. And Udapon and Harp played this lane much better. I liked Harp a ton more on the Leona than on the Morgana in the last game. Clearly not something that I want to see them go to again. But the Tristana-Leona lane definitely worked out, so much so that Udapon is going to get my player of the game for game number 2 here. The Tristana pick really just opened up the map, I think, overall for DFM. It allowed them to play significantly more aggressive in the bot lane, which gave them the affordability, I guess, to give Azir more resources in the mid lane. And we all know with Yaharong, he can absolutely dominate the damage charts and the damage numbers on picks like Azir if he is given resources. He's one of these players, I talked about this a bit with Seiya on Isrus Gaming as well, but he's one of these players that does kind of need to farm up for 15 and 20 minutes to get to his power spike, but he's a phenomenal team fighter. He's able to output a ridiculous amount in the back half of the game, and if you get there, he's going to reward you for it. He definitely did that in this game on the Azir. There's really nothing that Galio can do to significantly punish that lane in the early game to the point where Yaharong would be getting behind. It's really up to the jungle to be able to create enough pressure just around the map that the Azir doesn't feel comfortable being able to step up in a situation like that. But that certainly wasn't the case because Steel played this second game, in my opinion, very cleanly on the Sejuani. The Sej and Hecarim matchup can be pretty good for the Sej depending on what happens. Obviously, Hecarim is going to have a lot of the early pressure, generally speaking, but if you're a good Sejuani player, you should know exactly where you need to be to kind of dissuade a lot of those 3v2 dives in the bot lane, or the plays trying to, I guess, punish the Azir pick in the mid lane. Whatever it ends up being, right? You can just kind of have your presence there, and all of a sudden that play is significantly less valuable for the enemy team. And if you get to that break point, you're just simply going to be stronger than Hecarim without kills. And that's kind of what happened in this game, is DFM just ends up outscaling. You hit this point around 20, 25 minutes, where you simply just win fights with Azir, Tristana, Sejuani, like Leona going in, even the Gnar for backup that, like, there's really nothing else Loud can do at that point. They had to generate a gold lead, and they weren't able to do that in the way that they were able to do in Game 1. In fact, DFM had a pretty sizable gold lead going into the back half of this game. So you got to give a lot of credit to DFM. I think everybody on this team played a lot better, especially this bot lane. If they can get to that late game power spike, like, they're going to be in a good spot. And honestly, they played the laning phase significantly better. I'm not going to put it entirely on them, at least for laning phase, because I just simply don't want to see Brance on Seraphine. He's been so good on these aggressive picks, most notably the Misfortune, that putting him on Seraphine just feels like a crime. It's kind of against everything that Loud has played for over the course of both this year and this tournament, and so definitely don't want to see that again, but this comp is just so bad. You're relying so much on the Hecarim, and he's really not able to generate the same kind of lead that you need him to. DFM gets out to that gold lead, and Hecarim's not really the type of champion that's going to solo be able to catch you back up. He needs to be super oppressive from ahead in order to be able to win the game in the way that a lot of people are prioritizing him in a lot of these drafts to do. You also kind of have the Aatrox here, where Aatrox can carry. Robo didn't build the carry build. He went the Gore Drinker build, which typically I like more. I've talked about that on the channel. I like Gore Drinker typically more than Eclipse, but in this case, you're relied upon a ton for the damage with the Galio Seraphine as your other two quote-unquote carry roles, and so I think Eclipse was kind of necessary for Robo. He certainly played some moments very well. He was able to generate at least an okay lead in the early game, but man, he is just so consistently out of position towards the back half of these games. It was a big problem I had with him in Game 1 on the Olaf as well. Luckily for him, he was on Olaf, which means that a lot of his misposition mistakes weren't really punishable, because he could just press ultimate, not be CC'd, and run out, and he would typically be fine. But on the Aatrox, that's significantly less easy to deal with, because you don't just have that cleanse button that you can use to get out of any situation. So when you are caught out, you're caught out. So much so that he's actually going to get my dud of the game here for game number 2. He really needs to learn where he needs to be at any given time. He was relied upon a ton for this game, and honestly, there were circumstances in which I could see them being able to take some team fights around the 20 to 25 minute mark, but he was so out of position in so many different circumstances that at this point, it was just very frustrating to watch him, and for that, he is going to get my dud of the game, but you got to give a lot of flack to Tinones, who lost lane pretty hard to Yaharong. Yaharong got onto that power spike, and by that point, the Galio was completely useless in this game. And then Seos on the Alistar, he certainly tried to make plays, but there's only so much you can do as the Alistar in that instance. Again, I don't want to see Brance on the Seraphine. Croc on the Hecarim's fine, but you have to play to it more in the early game. Overall, not a good game from Loud, not a good draft from Loud. I need to see a complete role reversal here for this team in order to feel comfortable about them moving into game number 3. Obviously, we know they're good players, but just get them back on something that they're going to be more comfortable playing on, something that they can push the advantage on in the early game. That's really what got them here, is their great early games, and this is just not the comp to be able to exploit that. For DFM, this is great. Like, they found a weakness in Loud's comp. They were able to exploit it. The scaling Azir pick wasn't punished. You can pick the Tristana to try and match the Seraphine. A lot of things kind of went in your favor here. I'm not expecting you to draft gap Loud in the same way moving into the rest of the game, so you are going to have to step up, but this is a good bit of confidence to have moving into the rest of this series. But is Loud going to be able to answer back and reclaim kind of control of this series going up 2-1, or is that 2-1 going to be in favor of DFM, and are they going to be moving into a position to prove they are still the best minor region team in the world right now? Well, we move on to game number 3, and the winner of game number 3 was Detonation FocusMe. They are able to take game number 3, back-to-back games here, definitely a confidence booster, and more importantly, they're able to take control of this series by going up 2-1 against the champions of the CB LOL. A much better draft on the side of Loud this time. I certainly can at least see the idea of what they want to go for. It wasn't really listening to any of the advice I gave at all. It definitely moved to a more scaling ideology, but at least you have a win condition and a plan in this one that I think structures a lot better. Unfortunately for you, DFM takes that and raises you a Sivir Yumi. And I've been talking about it on Twitter a lot. I've been talking about it on the channel here. I don't get why Sivir Yumi isn't still being prioritized rather heavily. I know that the early game AD carries are strong. Things like the Misfortune, even the Caitlyn, right? The Draven we're seeing a lot of bans of. The Kalista in the same boat. Like, these are very good picks. And Sivir's certainly not in the same kind of spot where she is like the number 180 carry in the meta. She's going to be meta defining. Nobody's going to be able to beat her, pick her ban kind of levels. Like, she's not that kind of carry anymore. But to pretend like she's not still absolutely dominant if you can hit that 3-item power spike on her is just a fallacy, right? She's still incredibly strong, especially with the changes to Yumi. I talked about this a lot in my meta preview video, and I think people are really starting to catch on. The changes, quote unquote, to Yumi have actually been a little bit interesting for the champion. Yes, her heal ability and her movement speed are reduced and they're on a much longer cooldown and you can't spam them nearly as much. But that damage increase on the Q and the cooldown reduction on the ultimate is absolutely ginormous for the proactivity of this champion. I think it actually allows you a little bit more general safety in the laning phase because teams can't afford to engage nearly as often. You've essentially become one of the better poke mages in the game. You've basically taken the role of Lulu and you just do it better and significantly safer now because her damage is actually completely out of control. Not to mention the fact that the ultimate being on a shorter cooldown means that the timing of the other enemy, like bot lane, has to be significantly better in order for you to even think about being able to pick up kills and punish that bot lane. And so if all of this is kind of compounding in the sense of Sivir, Yuumi, you know, they're just going to be safe all of laning phase, right? Because you've got the spell shield, you've got Yuumi heals, you've got the ultimate, all the poke damage coming out from Yuumi. It's just really difficult to actively deal with that. If all of that is compounding and you're going to have like a non-important, non-stressful bot lane, right? Like something that both sides scale on, well, there's still not a lot of champions in the game that scale at the same level that Sivir does. And so you're still going to hit that power spike. You're still going to be doing a ridiculous amount of damage in the game. And that's what happened here. Sivir, Yuumi completely took over the back half. We got to 29 minutes. We got to 3-item Sivir and the game was over. My player of the game is going to go to Harp on this Yuumi because the damage is legitimately absurd. Like, this is top of the team levels of damage coming out from the Yuumi, and that's just the kind of champion she is now. The heals are significantly worse. Like, it is definitely noticeable, but pretending like she is not incredibly oppressive to play into in laning phase, even at the pro level, is just not true, and I think we saw that in this game. Unfortunately, for all the people that were hoping that Sivir Yuumi was going to die over the course of this tournament, I very much do not think that will be the case. I think this proves otherwise. Yutapon had a good game, but also made some really, really bad plays. Made a really bad play in game number 1 on the Caitlyn, where he net backwards and had to blow his flash essentially for no reason. Small mechanical misplay, but it happens, right? Makes another one in this game where it seems like he's trying to, like, AWOC or something, right? And he accidentally hits the blast cone and he blast cones himself right in the middle of the enemy team and just dies. That's absolutely tragic. There's a chance he's able to kite out a considerable amount there, maybe do a bit of damage. He's probably safe all along no matter what, but I mean, these small plays are absolutely tragic for DFM. Luckily for them, he played great outside of that major mistake, but you just don't want to see these small mishaps, especially for a team that right now is one game away from facing RNG in a best of 5 tomorrow. Outside of that, the rest of the team comp makes a lot of sense. You go for the power picks in Hecarim, in Gnar, even Taliyah I would consider relatively a power pick because it enables the jungle position so much, and you really do want to get that Hecarim ahead. Just a lot of things that I think make a lot of sense for DFM, and a lot of things that I think really add to what this idea of a Sivir Yuumi comp wants to do. You have a more proactive jungler that can help, guide you through the early game a little bit better. You have a mid laner that is going to be able to help that jungler out, even move bot lane if you want to make sure that Sivir stays safe. And then you have a Gnar who's just going to be fine in team fights, right? A lot of compounding things that I think work out for DFM overall. As for Loud, in this case, I like this draft significantly better. I certainly don't think you can blame it nearly as much for everything that happened in this game, but again, it kind of goes away from your strengths. I'd always thought Loud's strengths throughout this tournament were really good early game aggression, knowing their limits, knowing how to generate that lead, and then doing a good job of being able to maintain that lead and push forward. That's what they did against Fnatic in their really big upset win, but you draft a very late game scaling comp here. Obviously, the Maokai, the Lissandra, the Kai'Sa clearly want to scale. You draft that split pusher slash, anti-fighter here with Jax in the top lane for Robo, just to put him on something that's a little bit more proactive because he has kind of been your proactive member throughout Worlds so far. I definitely understand the ideology, but I just don't like Brance on the Kai'Sa. I get it, there aren't a lot of good ADs left that are not banned out, but Misfortune is up, and I just don't understand why you're not going for it, because I just simply think it is the best that your team has looked on that champion. I understand if maybe you don't feel as confident after last game, but it's hard for me to say that the bot lane alone was the problem with game number 2. And so you go to the Kai'Sa Rel, you're really not able to contest the Sivir Yuumi at all, and they're actually able to outscale you. I talk about this with Kai'Sa a lot. Kai'Sa into other scaling matchups honestly isn't all that consistent. Yes, Kai'Sa can do hyper carry damage level numbers, right? She is incredibly strong, but oftentimes you're going to want to see Kai'Sa as a counterpick to some other shorter range, early game dominant poke, whatever champions. The Misfortune, the Kalista. I understand the Kai'Sa more if you want a scaling pick in matchups like that. Where I don't understand the Kai'Sa is into other hard scaling champions, things like the Sivir, things like the Aphelios, because not only do you lose lane, but honestly, it's more difficult for you to be able to, quote-unquote, do your job of hyper carrying in the late game than it is for those other two. You have to put yourself in so much more risk than the other two, and they honestly give a similar amount of payout, and they're going to be better than you in lane. And so I don't like the Kai'Sa pick, especially as a blind in this matchup, which it was. And so, honestly, I just don't want to see teams prioritizing Kai'Sa nearly this high. It's an incredibly strong pick, and I get it's a takeaway from Yutapon, but if you're that scared of Yutapon getting it, just ban it. There are better things to leave up, in my opinion, because you're kind of handicapping your game a lot by going to such a late game AD carry in a comp that doesn't really have any early game pressure for a team that really needs to be able to generate that. Like, you have to go into a Hecarim as a Maokai with no winning lanes. Like, maybe the Lissandra can do something, but even then, like, Taliyah should have full shove in that lane. Like, Jackson and Gnar, you're not really going to be able to take advantage of that in the way you want. And Sivir Yuumi, you're never going to be able to get on top of. So, like, where exactly is your pressure coming from? Even outside of all of that, like, DFM was making a lot of proactive map plays across the map, and so the dragons were opened up. Croc did a really good job of prioritizing a lot of these objectives, and they actually were able to get Infernal Soul in this game, which makes it even more shocking that they go and take a fight without their AD carry towards the back half that just straight up loses them the game. It's a completely brainless decision to make, and I don't know who to blame for it, but it was absolutely devastating to watch a team do that without their Kai'Sa, their hyper carry. Like, I have no idea what the idea was there, but completely game losing for Loud. My dud of the game is going to go to Croc in the jungle on the Maokai. Like I said, just got completely out-tempoed. Not entirely his fault, because generally speaking, Hecarim should be able to out-tempo Maokai in a pretty easy way, but for him to just have no pressure this game, all that good outside of the Baron steals in game 1 in this series so far, he's really been outplayed by Steel, I think, for a majority of these games, and if he wants to put Loud in a better position, him and Robo were really the two that I talked about going into the series needing to be those guys, because Branson and Seos, they're going to do their thing. They're probably going to be fine in the late game so long as they have teammates to play around. But Robo and Croc just have not been it. And then, speaking on Tinones, he's just been beaten by Yaharong in every single laning phase. He's not been a problem, but he certainly hasn't been a positive for Loud, and you need to see more out of him. Obviously, Yaharong is massive for this DFM team, and if he's going to be able to get ahead so frequently, it's going to make that game even more difficult to win. So, overall, what do I want to see? I want to see Loud go to an early game comp. I want to see them try to actively be generating their own lead, because they are much better playing from ahead than they are playing from behind, in my opinion. For DFM, just keep the ball rolling. I think you found your niche. You want to play through that bot lane scaling. You have a pick like Taliyah or even like an Azir, whatever ends up being in the mid lane that you can let kind of get online and can be that secondary damage threat. Steel and Heavy are going to be rock solid in the top lane as long as they're being invested in, and I think that's a really nice strategy for you to have. You've clearly found your niche. Just stick to it. Obviously, Loud probably going to go for a more early game comp. Just be prepared. If you can win the early game as DFM, you probably will have the game in your hands. And so, is that going to happen in game number 4? Is DFM going to close out our second series of the day in 4 games as well? Or is Loud going to kick us to a Silver Scrapes game 5, the first potential Silver Scrapes of Worlds in 2022? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Detonation. FocusMe. They are able to take game number 4 in the series and take the series overall at 3-1, pushing themselves into the top 4 of play-ins, and you gotta feel good for this DFM team here. Obviously, the LJL is a region that I think a lot of people unjustly look down on. It's never really been considered one of the premier minor regions, but DFM has gone a long way in the last 2 years alone to prove that is just simply not the case. Them being able to finish first in their playing groups last year, them being able to beat up on a Loud team that everybody had high expectations for, maybe not going into the tournament, but certainly going into the series, and for them to do it so convincingly, even in the game they lost, there were certainly moments where it felt like they could win. Like, DFM just looks great. This is the greatest team in Japanese League of Legends history, and they prove it over and over again. Titans of the LJL, like Evi, like Steel, like Yutapon, that have been around forever, that continue to make waves on the international stage. It's just gotta feel good. And a weird random note here that you probably wouldn't have expected, but because they finished first in their group last year, they didn't have to play a best of 5. This is the first ever international best of 5 win in LJL history. No Japanese team has ever won an international best of 5 before. DFM beating Brazil and beating Loud in this case solidified them as one of the best, if not the best, minor region in the world, depending on what you consider the VCS and the PCS. To me, they're like 1.5, right? They are the best, like, true minor region in the world. They're the best team that only gets 1 seed at Worlds, and I think they've proven that year in and year out, and you've got to give a lot of respect to this team. And what a game from their veteran captain, the player who's been on this team the longest of anybody, Yutapon there in the bot lane. He gets his signature Kai'Sa, the pick that's kind of been banned or picked away from him most of this tournament. He really did dominate earlier in this tournament on a couple of games on it, and then teams realized, like, we just can't give it up to him. Loud realized that they needed to go to something significantly more safe than the aggressive Kai'Sa. They go for the Ezreal, which... it's something, it's not what I wanted to see, but at least it has some level of proactivity, but it's a lot safer, right? You can protect yourself significantly more. You're not relying on your team nearly as much as you are with a Kai'Sa pick. But Yutapon on Kai'Sa certainly proves that that was a mistake. If you weren't going to pick it, you might have, well, banned it, because, man, Yutapon was just going to destroy you here. A great early game from DFM. Steel does a really good job making sure that Yutapon is in a really good position to be able to carry this game. You pair that up with the Shen in the support role. This is a pick that we're really starting to see rise in prominence. Obviously, we saw RNG pull it out yesterday. We're now seeing DFM pull it out. And really, if you can pull it off, this is a really scary pick, because just having a Shen pop up into any little skirmish that's going to be happening, especially in the play-ins, which has been a pretty decisively skirmish-heavy meta, having a Shen just show up and being able to taunt is absolutely huge. And that combo with Kai'Sa, I think, is incredibly interesting, because you can have that Shen ult, like, channeled onto Kai'Sa, and then she can ult in and basically deliver the Shen. It's very similar in a lot of ways to a lot of the other quote-unquote, like, Shen delivery comps that you have out there. I think Kai'Sa actually just does it in a way where she appreciates the shield almost more than anybody, because that gives her not only all the bonuses that she gets with her ultimate, but that shield is absolutely ginormous. It basically doubles her health with her already pre-existing ultimate shield, and she's going to be doing a ton of damage in those teamfights. It gives her a ton of safety in that sense and allows her to play significantly more aggressive, and Yutapon with just a little bit of a leash and on that side is going to be able to dominate, and that's why he was a pretty easy choice for player of the game here in game number 4. The Kai'Sa damage went crazy, and it was a big reason why we had a 26-minute win, but certainly Harp lived up to that as well. A great game 3 from him on the Yuumi, another great game 4 from him on the Shen. This bot lane was great in this series overall, but I gotta give a ton of credit to Yaharong. Like, I know he's not the flashiest player in the world, but he does remind me of a lot of the top mid laners that we've known for many, many years. No, he's not ridiculously flashy, but man, is he ridiculously consistent. He is always winning lane, pretty much no matter who he's facing. He's going to be up in CS. He's going to be very up in gold, mostly because he's not nearly as proactive on the map, which can sometimes harm his lanes, but like, Tinones was making roams, and they just weren't becoming anything in this game, while Yaharong was just shoving in the wave, collecting huge amounts of EXP and gold, and was just able to scale up into the late game, and he was so much more useful than Tinones this entire series, just overall. This was a pretty big mid-gap, I would say, for DFM, and it was another big reason why they had the luxury of being able to play through bot lane so much significantly more, because they had faith that just leaving the two alone in the mid lane 1v1, the Yaharong was going to be able to win that 10 times out of 10, and honestly, he won it 4 times out of 4, so it's hard for me to like, argue with the results, I guess, in that case. Really, really good series from him. He pulls out the Victor here in game number 4 and looks really good on it. The damage is strong. Like, Victor's damage is high. He's by far the highest damage control mage in the game right now, in my opinion, and I think he proved that here. Evie and Steel, while not necessarily being the focal points of the series, certainly did their parts. Like I said, Robo and Croc, incredibly important players in the general grand scheme of things for Loud, and Evie and Steel really needed to step up and match those counterparts in order to make sure that the strong players of DFM had a chance to be able to carry without too much resistance. And I think you can make a real case that both Evie and Steel outplayed Robo and Croc in this series. Obviously, Robo had some highlight plays in games 1 and 2 on the Olaf and then on the Aatrox, but for the most part, Robo was incredibly inconsistent, especially in this game 4. He pulls out the Camille, again trying to punish the Snar pick, but it just does not work out. He's able to be trapped. Like, the Camille Galio doesn't work nearly in the way that it needs to. Kind of similar to our first series of the day, but just a little bit different here. The Camille pick does not work. Robo's going to get my dud of the game here in game number 4. He had a down series. Again, I think he tried to do too much. I get it that Loud really wanted to propel him, but maybe they were over-propelling him. Brance is a really freaking good player, and it felt like they didn't invest in him at all in this series, which was very frustrating as a fan of Loud and as a fan of that player. I don't understand why you don't invest in Brance, why you put him on Ezreal in the winner-go-home game 4, but a lot of pressure on the Camille to be able to carry a lot of the damage in this game, and he couldn't quite live up, unfortunately. Croc did not have a good one either. We've been kind of hinting that he's been being out-jungled by Steel, but, like, this was the most obvious example, in my opinion, of him being out-jungled. This was a really bad game for Croc. Everything just kind of falling apart for Loud just in general this entire game, and it sucks because they were a team that I think really made a lot of people happy at this World Championships. That clip of Brant's, you know, killing Hylissang and then having bot gap on his arm, like, that's gonna live in infamy forever, and they deserve to be remembered. Like, this Loud team was incredibly fun. They did a lot for just the perception of the CBLOL and for Brazil as a region as a whole, because I don't think a lot of people, me included, were really taking Brazil all that seriously going into this tournament. My perception certainly has changed. Hopefully we can start getting back to some of the Brazils of old, you know, obviously Kaboom, but like the BRTTs of Brazil, like, they deserve their recognition, and we may have a new generation of that coming through. Hopefully the CBLOL fans can have something to cheer about over the next few years. This was a great start, hopefully, for what is Brazil kind of emerging into one of the better minor regions in the world. But unfortunately, it just wasn't good enough for this year. But who it was good enough for is DFM. Like I said, they are now moving on to face RNG. It's a pretty insurmountable challenge. We'll talk about that in the preview, but for now, you've just got to be happy. There were multiple points throughout this world stage that they were not looking like a team that was going to be playing in the final best of fives here, but they defy expectations. They get back to being probably the best minor region team in the world. Oh, I didn't mention, Udapon's my player of the series, by the way. Nothing against all the other players, but Udapon was awesome here and really propelled DFM over the top. It's good to see the captain really stepping up, and he's going to need it. Obviously, going up against Gala and Ming is a huge challenge for DFM, but this team's defied expectations once before. I mean, who really is to say that it's impossible for them to do it again? All right, well, that is going to do it for both of the 3-4 series that we had on the first day of play-in knockouts. Up on the screen right now, you're gonna see the 2 series that are gonna be happening today as this video comes out. Royal Never Give Up taking on Detonation, FocusMe, and the Mad Lions taking on Evil Geniuses. Only 2 of these teams are going to be getting spots along with Fnatic and DRX, and as you can see on the screen, I'm predicting that to be RNG and Evil Geniuses. Let's get into those explanations. Let's start with RNG and DFM. This one's certainly not controversial. RNG's the better team, and they're probably going to wipe the floor with DFM. I would love it if DFM was somehow able to take a game off of RNG. I think that would be miraculous, but it's going to be a 3-0. I mean, like, if it's anything else, it's going to be entirely surprising. RNG should have the one completely in the bag. Their playstyle actually matches up against DFM rather well. If they're able to generate a lot of leads through the mid lane, I don't really see how DFM has a lot of chances to come back. Udapon and Yaharong are going to need to be absolutely stellar in that series for DFM to have any chance. But for me, it's just too big of a gap. RNG should have that one incredibly cleanly. 3-0 is my prediction, and I don't think I'm shocking people by saying that. But I think I'm going for a little bit of an upset in the other matchup because I am going for Evil Geniuses, and I don't think a lot of people are on the EG hype train. Yes, they weren't all that consistent throughout the main group stage, losing and dropping games to a team like DFM, which they really shouldn't have been doing, but they really made up for it in the tiebreakers where they won both of them extremely decisively. They were leagues above both DFM and Loud when the games mattered the most, and I think that for me gives me a lot of confidence about them going into the series with Mad Lions. Obviously, there is a chance that Elyoya is just simply the best player in the series, but I personally have a lot of faith in Inspired and Jojo Pyun to step up and really prove that they are a budding, emerging superpower coming out of NA. I know Inspired just called Jojo the next Caps. I really do believe that is a projection that is realistic for Jojo Pyun, and I think this is his moment to prove it. I'm really excited for the series. I'm betting that it goes to 5 games. I would be shocked if it doesn't. These two teams are incredibly evenly matched. But I have it going to EG in 5 games. If it went to Mad Lions in 5, I wouldn't be surprised. Everybody on this channel knows I usually like to do 2-game spreads here. My 2-game spread is EG in 5 and then Mad in 5. You know, it's going to happen one way or the other, but for me, if I had to tip that line in one direction, just barely, it's going to be Evil Geniuses, even though if Mad won, like, I'm not going to be surprised even in the slightest, right? Like, these two teams are incredibly evenly matched, and this is a very difficult call to make, but call it NA bias, call it whatever you want, call it faith in JoJo, but I'm going with Evil Geniuses in this one. So I have my 4 teams coming out of play-ins being Fnatic, DRX obviously because they won the group, RNG, and then Evil Geniuses. And that was who I had coming out to begin with anyways. So not a lot of surprises here, not a lot of changes. Obviously, maybe the process is a little bit different, but I'm sticking to my guns. These are the 4 teams I had predicted going into the tournament, and I'm really not, I haven't seen enough to change my mind in that regard, but that is going to do it for this video. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down in the comments section below. Obviously, if you enjoy this type of content, I really do recommend that you hit the like button. It really does mean a lot for the channel as a whole. It lets me know not only that you guys are enjoying the video, but obviously that kind of interaction really helps get these videos out to more people. I'm a little bit niche on the internet. I know with the kind of content that I'm making, this more long-form podcast style information, in-depth recaps on all of these games. If you know anybody that would be interested in that type of content, feel free to share this around, but even just commenting, hitting that like button already does wonders for that job as it is. And then, of course, if you did enjoy this video and you're not subscribed, if you made it to the end of this hour-and-a-half long video, I highly recommend you hit subscribe. If you liked this video, you're gonna like everything else I put out on this channel. I really like to go in depth, and I definitely like to do my research and try to provide as analytical and unbiased content on this channel as I possibly can. One of the big fun parts of professional League of Legends and professional just sports or esports or anything as a whole is the storylines and the narratives, and I really hope you guys are enjoying the narratives and the storylines that are being created here at Worlds. It's just, I'm lucky enough to be someone that can convey all of that to you, and if you enjoy that, if you enjoy the telling of all this that I get to do on the channel, I would really recommend you hit that subscribe button, hit that bell so you can see all of the Worlds content that we'll be putting out daily on this channel. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.